So first of all, I just want to welcome everyone. Thank you all for taking the time this evening to discuss and deepen this conversation among labor and community activists around a really critical topic. For those that don't know me, my name is Colin O'Malley. I'm the Chief of Staff for the Rochester and Genesee Valley Area Labor Federation. We're a federation of unions in this 11 county area, representing roughly 70,000 members in over 50 organized unions. Before I begin, I just want to thank the leadership of Next Up, Julie Garrett and Carrie Asanato. This is the Youth and New Leaders Caucus of the Area Labor Federation who are hosting the conversation tonight. Tonight's conversation is going to be a series of webinars brought forward by that caucus for any young people and new leaders interested in helping build the labor movement locally. Your activity would very much be welcome in that committee. And I will put my email in the chat later, so you can reach out to me if you'd like to be more involved. Tonight's topic, labor confronting fascism, is a timely and critical conversation. In the last few years, the far right, and in some cases explicitly fascist and white supremacist movements in this country have become boldened by rhetoric and seeming support from the previous president. And they've also become organized. They've gone from the lone gunman terrorist activities of the Charleston church massacre in 2015 or the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting in 2018. And they moved from those activities into accelerated in recent weeks organized insurrectionary activity, including a plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan, and the notable invasion and takeover of the Capitol building and the halls of Congress in DC. Some people see in these activities of the last week the violent final throes of the far right, losing power and being ushered off the political stage. I wish that I personally could see it that way. What I see is a far right that's grown more organized, built a large base of support, and that's moving into a new set of insurgent tactics and strategies. And as history shows us, the goals of that movement would be devastating for labor rights, devastating for people of color, devastating for immigrants, and threaten the very democratic notions that underline so much of our movement work. So today, we're going to be asking the question, what is labor's role in countering this dangerous movement? We've got three phenomenal guests with us today to help us dive into the topic. Each of them will get an opportunity to give some introductory statements, and then we'll move into more of a discussion with the group. For those familiar with Zoom, I'll really encourage you to use the hand raising option so that we can really talk, but you can always post questions in the chat as well. So our guests today, in order of their presentations, are going to be Gary Bonadonna Jr., International Vice President and Manager of the Rochester Regional Joint Board, Workers United, and Executive Vice President of the Rochester and Genesee Valley Area Labor Federation. Karen Spotford, Executive Vice President of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists of the Rochester Chapter, and renowned author, organizer, and movement intellectual Bill Fletcher Jr. With that, I'll kick it off to Gary to start us off.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. And thanks to Colin for showing mercy and putting me first, so I don't have to follow my esteemed panelists, Karen and Bill. It'll be a warm-up act for these two. But I mean, with the topic, this could be a wide-ranging discussion. So I'll try to stay on track here because it's been discussed and analyzed exhaustively over the last 4 years, this descent, into fascism and the emergence of these far-right ideologies. But I mean, it's always been there. It's just seen more publicly, and more people have come out of the shadows under Trump, because he's, at least to his base, he's legitimized, that it's okay to be ultra nationalist and blame, quote, others for their problems, because fascism's all about an otherness, for people to blame or fear or hate. And it's like a nightmare revisiting all this stuff, under Trump, but it's building a wall on the US-Mexico border. It's a travel ban on Muslims. It's labeling Black Lives Matter protesters as thugs and looters. And those are the overt examples. There's thousands of dog whistles, and even his whole motto, the campaign slogan, make America great again. It's okay, great again for who? White males, maybe. Definitely wasn't great for women or people of color or the LGBTQ community. So it's this whole stoking of division and suspicion and hatred of something else, something other than yourself. COVID-19 being called the China virus or Chinese virus, the list goes on and on. So, and let's not forget labeling legitimate news as fake news. Trump wanted state-sponsored television. The founder of my union, Workers United, which was formerly the predecessor union, was the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. But the founder, Sidney Hillman, he believed in two major principles: one, a strong trade labor movement, and two, freedom of the press. But so now within the last couple of weeks of with the culmination of the attack on the Capitol, kind of segueing here for a second, but we're supposed to applaud corporations for taking a stand and distancing themselves from Trump, because this was a step too far. Okay, where were you the last 4 years? But going against Trump while he has a week left in office, it's awfully brave of you. But more importantly, empty statements from corporations are nothing new to the labor movement. They're all superficial and zero substance. And they use the language of solidarity while upholding oppressive systems. So for us at Workers United, fighting against white supremacy and fascism is not a separate issue from organizing workers on the job. And we can't fight for workers if we aren't fighting for all workers. If we're not supporting Black Lives Matter, supporting trans rights, supporting immigrant rights, supporting climate justice, all the intersecting issues that affect the working class. Because the labor movement is uniquely positioned to do the everyday work of uniting and coalition building, of helping the working class to unlearn the lessons of division and work together in solidarity. Our union in upstate, we put a public statement out back in June that defines us and our mission and our values. Forgive me, let me read it. I don't want to miss a word here, but I'll paraphrase how we end the statement. We are Antifa. Fascism seeks to ban unions and prevent workers from organizing. It entrenches white supremacy and class domination. It is the ultimate threat to the working class. We have no other option but to be anti-fascist. When they try to crush our movements, we fight back. We will continue to resist all efforts to destroy our solidarity, uphold white supremacy, and weaken the power of the working class. I think I'll end on that note, and look forward to hearing the other panelists, but thanks for listening, everyone.
Okay, thanks so much, Gary. And with that, we'll just move right over to Karen.
Hello, everybody. Actually, Gary just made it so simple. He took most of my points. So I will actually look into how can we counter the issues that he talked about. And countering the labor movements are a perfect place to counter racism, because we have members of all nationalities, all genders, all I'm sorry, excuse me, religions, all kinds of backgrounds, and we're already in these organizations that have a common goal. So we have the opportunity to speak with our members who are having these fascist characteristics. And we have to talk to them. We have to stop being afraid to speak up. We have to take this on like we take on management. We have to be aggressive without being confrontational, but we must make our voices known. And you being in the union is a perfect place to do it. Now, I work for a CSEA, and I do tend to work in areas that are MAGA areas. So I'm familiar with the mindset, but I go at them one on one, and I use my tools that I learned from the union. But I do press them, I do question them, I do challenge them. And as unions, we need to teach our members who are not in a fascist state of mind how to do so and work from there. So it's organizing from the inside, but that's what union gives us. That's the power it gives us. And I'm going to keep it short. Like I said, Gary took most of my opening, so I'm going to shut off the mic. I'd rather do the question and answers.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Karen, and I'm looking forward to the discussion as well. I'm also very much looking forward to hearing the thoughts of Bill Fletcher Jr., who we all in the labor movement owe a great deal to already, and I'm looking forward to seeing what he offers for us tonight. Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you, Colin. And I appreciate it, and I'm glad to do this. In these few short minutes, let me make a few points. One is that what we are seeing is a mass right-wing movement that's known as right-wing populism. Within it, there is a fascist core. But not everybody in this movement, this right-wing populist movement, I would identify as fascist. When I'm thinking about fascism, thinking about a very virulent strain of right-wing authoritarianism that seeks to completely destroy any vestiges of democratic capitalism and in effect annihilate opposition in the name of establishing a different brand of capitalism. And right-wing populism as a movement has various political tendencies, including fascist, including theocratic, and others. And so one thing that's very important for us is to be clear about these different tendencies within the right, because some of them can be played off against one another. Second thing is that in order to understand January 6th, you have to remember that this country was founded on the basis of settler colonialism and racial slavery, and secondarily on forced labor generally. And that the notion that was central to the foundation of the country was the idea that it was being founded as a white republic once the US became independent in 1783. The early definitions of citizenship were racial. You could be a citizen if you were a free white man, and that's basically what they meant. And the qualifications for becoming a citizen largely didn't change until 1924, which is really interesting because what that meant was that European immigrants could come to the United States, and after they proved that they were white, which was very, very important, believe it or not, there was a category in the 19th century called Provisional Whiteness that described Europeans who had not yet proven that they were white, which begs the question, how does one prove that one is white? Well, it's not by putting your hand up for someone to inspect. It had to do with your attitude towards Native Americans and Africans and Asians and Mexicans, and the extent to which a person was willing to engage in active oppression. becoming a settler, becoming a part of a slave patrol. This within the notion of the construction of a white republic. Now, why do I say this? Because the people that were storming the Capitol on the 6th, waving the Confederate flags, are basically part of a movement that is saying that the white republic must be restored. They're saying, in effect, it does not pay to be white anymore in the United States, and that there has to be a reestablishment of what it means to be white. They're basically saying that the problems that most people in this country have with a declining living standard or a static living standard are the result of minorities, are the result of women being out of control, result of LGBTQ, right? And that we have to go to a simpler era, the era of Donna Reed and June Cleaver, that we have to return to the 1950s when men were men and women were girls. Black people knew their place and the only thing Latin was tacos, right? So you return to that period, and this is the critical image for the right-wing populist movement. Now, there's a lot more that I could say about this, but I'm gonna just, in the interest of time, identify two things. One, many people have said after seeing January 6th, this is not who we are. Well, that's wrong. This is who millions of us are. That what Donald Trump did very successfully in tapping into a right-wing populist movement was that you may be familiar with the story of Dorian Gray. I always like to refer to it. It's a fictional story about a guy who makes a deal with the devil. And the deal is that he will not age or become sick, but a portrait of him, which is hidden away in a closet, will age and become sickly. Whereas Dorian Gray himself will remain young, he'll be very healthy. What Donald Trump did was he pulled the picture of Dorian Gray out of the closet and he presented it for the entire world to see. This is who we are. And he went further and said, this is what we should be proud of, that we should be proud of making fun of the disabled, that we should be proud of mocking Mexicans and other Latinos, that we should demonize Muslims, that we should hold Black people responsible for all of the problems of the United States. I mean, this is all in the picture of Dorian Gray. He pulled it out and millions of people looked at it and said, yep, you're absolutely right, Donald. That is us. And you know what? We like it that way. And this is what's at the core of this right-wing populist movement, which raises a very interesting question. What do you do about these folks? What do you do about them when they're in our unions? So I'm going to suggest a couple of directions to think about. I would argue that the core of Trump's base and the core of the right-wing populist movement are people that I would describe as zombies. Now, I have a doctorate in zombieism, so I can tell you a little bit about it. I've studied zombieism quite a bit. And one of the things that anyone knows watching any zombie movie is that once you become a zombie, you lose your humanity. There's no going back. Once you're a zombie, that's it. And what we have to understand about the core of Trump's base is that they are zombies. They have lost their humanity. They've lost their empathy. Think about the people that would laugh when Trump was mocking a disabled person. I mean, what do you say about that? What do you say about someone who is holding Mexicans responsible for crime and rape, but never once in 4 years mentioned the most dangerous criminal organization in the United States, the Russian mafia? Not once. What do you say about that? What do you say about people that would sit back? And this is part of my zombie test, by the way, which is to ask somebody, what did you say or do when Trump disparaged veterans and deceased servicemen and women? Now, just to go out on a limb, Could you imagine if Barack Obama had disparaged veterans? Would we even be talking about Barack Obama? Would he even be alive? Right? Yet, people have been willing to go for that. You know, what do you say about someone who was willing to lie to us about the COVID crisis? There's a few other things. When people can't answer those questions, you understand at that point that they're zombies. You understand at that point that one-on-one debating them has no point. There's no point to it. Because what the right-wing populist movement has done, and it has the advantage now of social media, is that it has surrounded itself in a self-reinforcing bubble. A bubble that is contributed to by the likes of Fox News and some of these other outfits that reinforces irrationality, so that people continue to hear the same nonsense and they have no way of touching base with reality. It's sort of like we're debating the Flat Earth Society. The only way that this group will change is if and when their paradigm collapses because of some sort of dramatic revelation that throws up into the air everything that they've believed in. So within our ranks, there's several things that we have to do right now. So the union movement has to get off of its ass and get a bit of a backbone and start really talking about things like race and gender. It needs to talk about the way that this society operates. And it needs to do it in a way that moves people away, particularly white people, away from the sense of blaming others for their deteriorating living standard. That needs to be part of the educational work that our movement is doing. This is not about debating Trump supporters. It's about educating our members about what is actually going on and encouraging them to read, to think, etc. Another thing that we have to do is we have to direct our organizations, our central labor councils, our local unions, etc., into actual fights that take on the demand for racial justice. So it's not just about ideology. It's about making it clear that part of the job of our organizations is to be an instrument for justice. And this too will start to help towards a reawakening. And the third part is that we have to link the fight around racial justice and the fight for economic justice, which is something that people needed to be thinking much more about on Martin Luther King's birthday. Because central to the thinking of King was the necessity of linking the fight around economic justice, racial justice, and indeed global justice. If we can't bridge that, then we're toast. Because one of the things that the right wing has, their arguments are simple. Their arguments may be irrational, but they appeal to people who are looking for scapegoats and looking for easy answers. We're not going to win people simply on the basis of facts. We'll win people when we put together a story that touches their reality, but takes them in a direction, in a progressive, socially just direction. And I'll stop there for now.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. You know, I'd want to ask sort of one question to just start to kick off the conversation a little bit. And there's already questions starting to come in. So what I'll encourage folks is, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's the reactions button. If you click reactions, you can click one that's next to it says raise hand. I will make a point to go to those first. So please, if you've got questions and you're already ready to ask some, head there. I'm going to ask that we preference questions to statements. So if folks can lean towards questions, that would be very helpful. And I guess I want to start off with a question I've seen in some in a number of reports on this some sort of stuff at this point, a claim that freaks me out, I got to be honest, that in some ways the U.S. population was lucky that Trump was such an incompetent effort at an autocrat. He immediately angered his intelligence community. He immediately created divisions between himself and the military community. And I'm wondering, given that, what, the threat that we could be facing 4 years from now in another presidential election, or in the years between now and then, a more competent rising autocrat who could more effectively use and wield the reins of power to move us in the direction of autocratic leadership. What can the labor community as a whole be doing in the next few years to minimize that possibility? And that's to the whole panel. So anybody that would like to jump in, please feel free to. Although I can say from conversation with the panel before that I think we all might end up deferring quite a lot to you, Bill, which nobody I think will feel insulted by me saying that publicly, I don't think.
Well, I'm honored by that. I think that there's a lot of truth to what you said. Trump is a narcissist, and he proved himself to be very incompetent at certain things. I think you are correct that there could be a much smoother fascist that emerges. And so what we have to do, there's several things. The union movement right now needs to be demanding that the federal government and state governments prosecute the fascists. We need to put them under the jail. Anybody that was involved in a coup attempt on January 6th should be under the jail. There should be no slapping of the hand. There should be no selective prosecution. These people need to be put away for a very long time. And that's going to be important because if you remember in 1923, the Nazis' beer hall putsch in Munich resulted in Hitler being imprisoned. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years, which was really light. He only served 1. And so coming out of jail, he was a hero. And so one of the things that's important is that there needs to be penalties for being a fascist and engaging in a coup. In some places, if you engage in a coup and lose, you lose your life right there, right? So at a minimum, we need to be talking about prosecuting, and the labor movement needs to be there. A second thing is that we need to be doing very broad educational work, not only in our ranks, but outside of our ranks. So one of the things that you have to be careful, fascists are bullies, fundamentally. And one of the things that has sometimes helped is to actually kick their ass. Now, I'm not going to go into any elaboration on that because I don't know who's recording this, but there are nonviolent approaches to dealing with them, which includes out-organizing them. They show up, we double the numbers. You know, if there's going to be 1,000 of them, there's 3,000 of us, right? So one of the things that frightens them is when we respond, progressives respond en masse. I remember in the 1980s, the Klan announced that they were coming to Boston. And all of these anti-fascist forces, liberals, progressives, radicals, mobilized. Turned out there was like about 100 Klansmen. I think there were like 3,000 of the rest of us, and chased these guys out of town. I don't know whether they had to swim out of Boston. I'm not sure, but they vanished. And it really, it's very important that we demonstrate that we are prepared to fight back. We need to emphasize the nonviolent approach. I'm not suggesting to go out and whack people at all. I'm saying that we have to organize, we have to demonstrate a nonviolent approach, but a mass approach. The other thing that's going to be very important is our fight for political power. One of the dangers of the moment that we're in is that what happened, one of the lessons to learn from the Obama years is that what Obama did is that he didn't do enough to inspire his base, but he did just enough to piss off the opposition. So he incited, by taking certain steps, but really not going far enough, the right wing, like the Tea Party, saw the end of the world as far as they were concerned. And they mobilized. Whereas progressives were very often uninspired and did not mobilize. So one of the dangers of the situation is if Biden doesn't go far enough, the other side is going to get mobilized, remobilized. And in the midterm elections and in 2024, we'll come back with a vengeance. That's one of the reasons that we have to be putting an immense amount of pressure on Biden and other elected leaders who claim to be representing working people. We've got to make sure that they do more than they were planning on doing, because otherwise we will face a possible retribution. We can't afford it, because the next time around, I think that there will be someone who's more sophisticated than Trump, who runs for office.
I'd like to piggyback on that because I do hear a lot of that. The fact that people truly believe, people outside of the MAGA group, that if Mike Pence had actually been president, we would have been in a lot more trouble because he knew how to work the system. He knew the ins and outs of the government. He had friends in the government, where Trump came in and alienated everyone he could. He was great with marketing, but he didn't know how to govern. And if we had someone in there who could govern, we would have had a lot harder fight. But I agree with Bill that we need to educate our members. And while I said I don't argue with MAGA people, I don't back down from them. I go one-on-one with them. I confront them with anything they have to say when they come to me, because a lot of times I have, they don't agree with people who are not Christians. I said, well, Christians are not the only and not the first religion that ever came about. There were religions before, there'll be religions afterwards. As long as you have your faith and you practice your faith and don't intrude on anybody else's space, why do you care? I push that. As far as racism and the fact that characteristics of racism, I've been dealing with that all my life. So I push back on that at every turn. Anytime they tell me, and I most of the time, a lot of them, I know it's going to start, well, they're taking our jobs. And I say, you're a union member. How are they taking your job? I've had people come to me, and before I was a leader in the union, I worked as an IT professional, and I would have people, MAGA people, I knew what they were, saying, why are we giving prisoners the opportunity to learn a skill? Because we had at one time we had a training, but we had a training where we would teach inmates how to repair computers. I was a computer programmer, but the first thing we said, well, they're going to take your job. I said, first of all, no one can take my job. Why are you saying that? We're making sure that the recidivism rate goes down because we're going to give them a viable employment opportunity upon release from incarceration. So what makes you think they're going to take your job? And I put it to them and I said, how can they take your job? Explain to me, because if you can't explain it to me, that means, excuse me, you don't understand. And that's how I go back and forth with the people who are the pro-Trumpers when it comes to the racism, when it comes to anxiety about their positions. The tendency for violence, I can push back because I tell them when they start on that, and yes, and we're Second Amendment and we want our guns, and I'll just tell them, I said, oh, good. I used to be a card carrying member of the NRA too, in those same places that you go to train, I go to train. So don't get stupid. A lot of people believe in Second Amendment. That's not just yours. So I tend to push back that way depending on who I'm speaking with. But I'm in a position now because I work for the union and they need me more than I need them. I have a bully pulpit that I can push back. But that's why I tell people join the union, become leaders in the union, rise the ranks of the union, because that gives you a voice that you ordinarily wouldn't have. And I understand what Bill's saying, and getting us together in mass to push back. But sometimes the best way to get to a person is one-on-one and challenge everything that make them convince you. I said, well, if you are that, excuse me, I've been getting over a cold. If you're that sure of your ideals, convince me. If you can't convince me, that means you don't have a leg to stand on to begin with. And that's how I push back.
Thank you, Karen. I want to, I'm going to start going to some of the hands here. I want to start off, I'm going to go to Dan Maloney. For those that don't know, our community allies here are from out of town. Dan is the president of the Rochester Genesee Valley Area Labor Federation and the Rochester Labor Council. Dan, go ahead.
All right. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to start by thanking the panelists. Excellent job, Gary, Karen, and Bill. Appreciate it, and all who are participating. So part of this, I believe what Bill was talking about, going back to the Nazis in the 20s, they had a propaganda machine, right? But the propaganda machine that has been built up over the last couple of decades here in America, the right-wing propaganda machine, would make Hitler blush, right? With what they're able to get away with the outright lies and falsehoods they propagate and put out there in all forms of media, print media, television, radio, and now on social media. And I think we do have to go after that to help halt fascism, because that's actually helping feed those zombies, right, with the ideas that incited them to insurrection on the 6th. A lot of these folks, they're kind of wandering, I think. It could go either way. There's that hardcore right-wing base. I've never understood how working folks can go ahead and back people that are actually screwing them, right? But they do with this propaganda machine that they've built. They have people voting against their own best interest, election after election, ever since Ronald Reagan. Actually, maybe before then, right? I'm sure Jim Bertolone knows a little history on this, but the right-wing propaganda machine it needs to be controlled. So a couple ideas. I know Candace, I think I saw her on the Zoom meeting here, put out a op-ed talking about reinstating the fairness doctrine. You have an opinion, that's fine. That's all it is. It's an opinion. Everyone has one. When you put it out in media, it better be fact-checked. Your sources better be vetted, and you better give equal time to the other side of that argument, like they used to, or the right wing made it illegal, pulled that law off the books. Also, truth matters. We all know that. We saw that. Facts matter. We should hold these media outlets to a higher standard of journalistic integrity. We should make sure that the owners and editors of these news media outlets are held to criminal responsibility for propagating known falsehoods and outright lies. So I have spoken to Schumer's staff, Joe Morelli's staff, and hopefully they get that cooking. I think that's important. Take back the narrative, the storytelling Bill spoke about, and we need to bring it back our way. FDR did it in some really tough times, right? And he brought over a whole lot of people that were hurting, working poor, middle class onto his side, onto the side of progressives. The right wing has pulled those same folks, middle class and working poor, into their camp with their propaganda machine. So I believe we need to have an all-out press to get rid of that. And again, truth in media. I'll stop there. And thank you again, panelists.
Unless anyone wants to respond to that at all, I'm going to move to Jim Bertolone.
Thanks, Colin. Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jim. Go ahead.
Thanks, Dan. I want to ask the panel, and especially Bill. I know Bill's been at loggerheads with different union leaders over the years. And the ones who are from the Rochester Executive Board have heard me. I've always believed we should be totally honest with ourselves while keeping our fights in-house, not for our members and not for the public. But even after 4 years of Trump, we have union leaders at the national and local level, and we talk about leadership, who think democracy is mob rule, are afraid to make strong statements against somebody like Trump because some of their members are Republican. And this goes all the way up to Trumka. It hasn't been all of our national union leaders, but it would have been really refreshing. You know, they all endorsed Biden, but it was very tepid, and you have the right to vote the way you want. Nobody says we all have the same bylaws. You can't be a good union member and a bigot. You can't. That's what we're about. You can't be a good union member and a bigot. The one thing to me that Trump did good is he revealed what the heart of the Republican Party has been since Richard Nixon. So I think one is addressing leadership in our own unions, who are too many, are afraid to tell the Republican members, and there's very few Republican members now that they're Republican because they believe in limited government and fiscal responsibility. That's bull. They don't have the guts to tell their members. And Dan, I know, knows this story, being from the UAW. I think it was back in the 50s. Some of the manufacturing plants the UAW had organized in the South, I believe this one was in Montgomery, they were having a real big problem with the new contract. Still Jim Crow. They wanted the blacks limited to certain jobs only. And even in those jobs, they insisted that the whites be paid higher wages. And they listened to their members patiently, and they listened to the white members patiently. And finally, Ruther and the UAW said, you can have high wages and high union benefits, or you can have discrimination, but you can't have both. That's it. And that was the end of it. And we need that kind of leadership. I mean, even Richard Trumka, did you hear him say once, you can't be a good union member and be a bigot and be a Trumper? Never heard it once. So I think we do have to do something to address our own local and national leadership within the unions. And I'd like to hear what the panel and especially Bill has to say.
So one of the things, James, I would say is we need to think about something that happened in 2016. And that is that many of the leaders of the bigger unions decided that there did not need to be a debate within our ranks about presidential endorsements. They decided that in their wisdom, they knew what was best, and therefore they pushed through an early endorsement of Hillary Clinton. And they pushed it through even knowing, because they're not stupid, even knowing that there was significant Bernie Sanders support and significant Trump support, such that there really should have been wide-ranging debates within the movement. But they knew better than us, right? They're smarter than us. So they pushed it through. And then in November 2016, something remarkable happened. This idiot gets elected president. And all of a sudden, a number of the leaders of these unions start looking around, and they start looking at these exit polls and they realized that somewhere around 40% of union families had voted for Trump. They realized in that moment that they didn't know their own members. And from 2016 on, we have seen something that I think could be fairly described as abject cowardice on the part of most leaders. They are so scared because they don't know who their members are. They've taken their members for granted, that they don't want to say anything that will piss off somebody. And so that means let's not really talk about race. Let's not really talk about gender. Let's try to play powwow, with Trump. And if Trump says something good about getting rid of a free trade bill, rally around him. If he throws a bone around the NAFTA reforms, let's show that we're truly bipartisan, despite the fact that we're dealing with a fascist. I would say it's absolute cowardice. And so you have leaders that have not been willing to step up to the plate and call it as it is. On Inauguration Day in 2017, several top leaders in the labor movement met with Trump. With Trump. The day, I think it was the inauguration day, it was the day after. And one of them, who will go nameless, but it's on the record, applauded Trump for his speech. And I was sitting there saying, what the hell is this guy saying? I mean, Trump just gave a speech using the term America First, which was the name of a quasi-fascist isolationist movement up till 1941. And you're going to say as a labor leader, bravo, Mr. President, right? So we've got some deep issues. And this is why one thing is we have to do some house cleaning within our ranks. There's some of our leaders that really have to be encouraged to retire. They've been waiting too long to retire. We need to encourage them, right? Because we don't need them. We need a different kind of leader, different kind of leadership that's prepared to fight. And particularly when you see what happened on January 6th, these folks are armed. They're not just using harsh language. And what that means for individuals, I'm not going to name names, but you whistle and I'll tell you the tune.
Chris McAnuff.
Thanks to all the panelists so far. So many tangents we could go down. I'm Chris McAnuff, Organizing Director at SCIU Local 200. And I guess my question, I agree with a lot of the different ways to confront fascism. So on the one hand, mobilizing the rank and file to be twice as big as their rank and file. On the other hand, asking the current administration to jail their leaders and hold them accountable. My question is, do we think that's realistic right now to get the current administration to jail their leaders? And if we don't, is there something we should be doing to try to, disorganize and go after their leaders directly and deal with their leadership?
Chris, I think it's entirely realistic. Just depends on how mischievous we want to be. Political leaders, elected leaders respond to pressure, as we all know. And unfortunately, and we saw this in the Obama years, too many of our leaders believe that pressure is going and having tea and coffee with the president and expressing our concerns. That's not what I'm thinking about as pressure. And I think that, we're in a pandemic. We need to have 1,000-car journeys to visit our leaders. Traveling the speed limit. through our cities will make our point. So I think, yes, it is entirely realistic, but it means thinking differently. You know, one of the things that happened in the whole healthcare debate in 2009 is that many union leaders got scared by the administration, because the administration said, if the unions keep banging the drum about single payer, that they were going to shut off communication. They're going to close the door on union leaders. And a number of union leaders, really, they panicked. Whereas, you know, I mean, no one called me, but if they had called me, let me tell you what I would have told them. I would have said, tell the White House, go ahead and do it. Just try shutting your damn door to us and then see what happens. You know, there's a time when you call people chumps, right? You just call them out. And they know full well that shutting off labor, it wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to work, but it's a good threat. And many of our leaders are so afraid that they're going to lose that time to have tea and coffee, that they're not going to get that phone call, that they're willing to buckle. That's what I'm saying. We need a different kind of leadership. You know, I often tell the story about the HBO series docudrama, The Band of Brothers, which I loved, about the 101st Airborne Division. And if you've never seen it, you got to see it. 101st Airborne Division in World War II. So in the second or third episode, after the paratroopers had landed, there's replacements coming up to the front, and they run into a non-commissioned officer. And the non-commissioned officer says to the replacements, "You're scared, aren't you?" And they say, "Yeah." And he says, "That's because you don't realize you're already dead." He said, "Once you realize you're already dead, you'll be able to fight the Germans. As long as you think you're alive, you're not going to be able to fight them." When I first heard that, I said, "Oh my God, what is this guy saying, right? Is this like kamikaze time?" No, what he was saying is something that our leaders don't get. That as long as you're mainly trying to protect your ass, you can't take down the other side. The moment that you realize it's all lost, then you can fight. And that's what our leaders need to understand. We're already dead. We have nothing to lose except buildings. So let's go after the other side. Let's put pressure, whether it's our so-called allies or against our enemies. And that's what I mean by needing a different kind of leadership that's looking at the situation as it is. We are in a war. January 6th showed that the other side was interested in turning it from a Cold War to a hot war. Now we can keep going on acting as if everything's hunky-dory, that this is a place where, you know, the US is exceptional from every other country on this planet, right? Or we can wake up and realize that the other side wants to take us down. So the question is, what the hell are we going to do? What kind of leadership do you need when you're in that situation? You know, to borrow from the astute political scientist, Michael Corleone, he said to Tom Egan, he said, "You know, Tom, sometimes you have wartime consigliaries and other times you have peacetime consigliaries. And now we need a wartime consigliere." The movement needs to understand that's our situation. And understandably, a number of our current leaders, they don't get it. They're peacetime consigliaries.
To add to that, see, and that's what kind of, I hate using the word leader in the union movement, because a lot of people get these positions because they're not leaders. They have positions because no one else wanted to do it, and they said, "Oh, well, I guess I'll take care." But they don't want to be leaders. They want to get into a position where they have perceived power. And before we can take on the power in the White House, we need to take on the power in the union movement and train and get real leaders. The people in the trenches are the leaders, and we need to train them. As long as someone steps into a position because they were unopposed, Get rid of that person right off the top. They don't belong there, and we need to get them out. And then once we train them, we need to educate ourselves about the issues that the Trump Republicans or Trump zombies. Learn about the issues. You can't argue, you can't figure out how to mount a fight against it if you don't listen to it. People laugh at me when I say I listen to Fox. I have to listen to Fox. I need to know what's going on in the minds of that movement in order to fight that movement. So to sit there and listen to, and it's easy for me to get comfortable and listen to MSNBC, which I love, and CNN and NPR. Sometimes I have to get in the trenches and listen to what they're dishing out, because you cannot fight it if you don't know what your enemy is. And then after we learn, we teach. We have to go, and then after we teach, we mobilize. Just like he said, like Bill said, get them by the crowds and go to not only the White House, you go to your city halls, you go to your legislature, your county ledge meetings, whatever your town boards, your school districts, and we need to be there in force, and they need to know that we're a force to be reckoned with. If we don't do that, we may as well step aside and let somebody get in there who's willing to fight. Because if you're not willing to fight, you're not part of the labor movement. You're just holding up a space.
So there was a comment that ended up in the chat that started a bit of a conversation, and I heard that she might have to leave real soon, but I do want to call her out anyways because the conversation's going on the side, and I think it'd be great for everyone to have. So Alyssa, if you do have a minute to introduce yourself and at least throw your comment out there, I think it would be a good one.
Sure. I have to leave in a minute to go pick up my kid because, that's another thing that workers do is, take care of children. And so, a few folks have been jumping into the chat and a couple things that Sarah said a while ago about like organizing in the Midwest during the farm crisis, right? And the ways in which when people are under, extreme economic duress, right, they are susceptible to these kinds of ideologies. And so, we know that wages have been stagnant in this country for decades, right? We know that corporate power and employer power is at its high peak. And so I really appreciate everything that folks have been saying around how do we confront people with these extremist views, both in our ranks and in our leadership and in our government and in the media, but also to think about this two-pronged approach that, this kind of economic grievance, right, that some people turn into a racial grievance, right, is one that we can also confront with just better organizing, right? To shift the focus to say, it's not some other person out there, right, who is the cause of, your sense that you can't make a living, right, or that your life is really precarious, but also it's the bosses, right, that they're making money off of you. And so to shift the sense of who the target of, our organizing really should be. It shouldn't be each other. It shouldn't be people of color if you're white, right? It should be the bosses who are taking your labor from you. So, and there was a kind of a good conversation going on in the chat, but that kind of incorporates that idea of a two-pronged approach. Like the more we organize for better conditions for workers, we lay a groundwork that takes away some of the rationale of this kind of economic grievance that's turned into this really dangerous political force. So I'll leave it there and look forward to what others have to say about this too.
Thank you, Alyssa.
Alan, can I comment on that?
Jump in.
Alyssa, that was so good. I in my opening statements, I kind of maybe a little clumsily was trying to making a connection to, to corporations and the boss, and because we organize around class. That's what we have in common. That's what brings us all together. Regardless of race and gender and religion. So yeah, these the white supremacy, that the things about corporations, these empty, it's all the virtue signaling in the world. Corporations could come they support everything in the world, pro BLM, pro this, pro that. They're pro everything except a worker's right to organize. So anyway, that's a great point about the economic resentment to it. It's all about, we organize around, around the working class. That's what unites us.
But I want to offer Alyssa and Gary a cautionary note here. Yeah, I agree, but I would say that there's some interesting things going on. They analyzed the vote in 2016 in the election, and they found an interesting phenomenon. Most voters that raised economics as their top issue voted for Clinton. Most voters who raised immigration and terrorism voted for Trump. They also found over time that Trump's base, contrary to what many people thought of it being a white working class base, is not. It's actually a base that is the upper middle and upper rings financially of the economy. Now, this is phenomenal, right? Because what it's saying is that the people that are rallying to Trump are not mainly the people who are suffering. It's the people who are fearing that they will suffer. This was true in Nazi Germany too, by the way. It's the people that fear that they're going to be crushed by the rich and by the poor that are looking for an exit strategy. They're looking for a savior. The Tea Party and Trump's base was that. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't white working class people that supported Trump. Obviously, there were. But it means that the core of his base is not necessarily who we thought it was. Now, the other part of this is that you can organize around economic issues. And if when I was in Boston dealing with the building trades, this happened all the time, where you could engage the building trades in some serious economic fights. But the minute that something came up about race, you might as well put a sheet over the head of most of the members, right? They did not see any inconsistency between fighting for economic justice and fighting for white supremacy, which means that our fight, as I think Jesse Jackson showed in 1988 during his campaign, it is uniting these two things, that the fight around racial justice and economic justice is not something that can be handled separately. It's got to be handled together. And we've got to be fearless in talking with white workers about why it is in their material interest to oppose white supremacy, not moral interests. Morality is great, but it's in their direct material interests to oppose racial injustice. And one of the problems is that I don't think enough of our leaders and members believe that, to be very honest. I think a lot of us think, well, it's actually, I'm not sure that that's true. But history demonstrates again and again, when you have gross racial injustice, white workers end up suffering. See that in the South, Southwest, where in a number of other places. When you have the fight for racial justice, that's when you end up building working class unity, and the working class as a whole strengthens. So you can't, there's no silver bullet, kind of this economic justice silver bullet that will get us around the race question. It just doesn't exist. If you don't link the two, again, like I said before, you're toast.
I hear that Denise Young has a question.
I also want to express my thanks to the panelists and Colin and all of those who are involved in putting this together. I think that it's so important that we have these opportunities. And I guess that's part of what is concerning me. very much appreciate the unique moment that we're in and how challenging it is to try to figure out how to bring new thinking into some situations. For example, the issue of structural racism and white supremacy, which have been with us since the founding of this country, but with new elements for at least those of us who are alive now, facing the kind of threat from an organized, armed, militant right wing in a way that we have not been confronted with before. And I guess I'm trying to figure out in my own mind how we put in motion the plans, the thinking, the campaigns, the strategies that are so necessary to move forward. I think, there's been a kind of a general critique of leadership, and I'm not sure exactly where that leaves us in terms of our sets of relationships that we have with each other, at least in Western and Central New York. But I think we have to dig down. I think there are questions that have to be raised. This issue that Bill was just cautioning us about, for example, and particularly as white working people, how we concretely prepare ourselves to have the kinds of conversations and actions and interactions with other union members in a way that is fruitful and moves us forward. I'm worried about how we structure ourselves to do that, President Maloney. And I think that we have to get busy quickly in terms of thinking some of this through. And I know I was struck about 10 years ago, frankly. I was in the TUC building in London for a meeting, and I was looking through the literature on the wall, and there was a whole set of curriculum on, get this, fighting fascism in the shops. And forgive me, but I said to myself, oh my God, I don't know if the AFL knows how to spell fascism, which isn't very kind of me, but it was so stunning to me that this level of awareness and implementation that other labor movements around the world, they know how to do some of this stuff. And to Bill's point about internationalism, I think we have to listen with that ear as well. I'll stop there, but I will say I'm down to help figure out how we move ahead. So
Denise, here's the good news. The Washington State Labor Council several years ago put together a working group of leaders to develop a racial justice curriculum for members. And it's available. You contact their Secretary Treasurer, April Sims, and it's available throughout the movement. People are using it. The California Labor Federation is getting ready to do the same thing. San Diego Imperial Valley's Central Labor Council is getting ready to do the same thing. The New York State Nurses Association is in a process of starting a racial justice educational project. So the good news is, after years of feeling like I and other people have been hollering in the wilderness, all of a sudden, particularly in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, segments of the movement said, all right, we got to start looking at this. Now, some are willing, as a result, to talk about this larger issue of right-wing populism and neo-fascism. And so the opportunities exist, there's materials that are out there, and we have to be willing to have educational programs. I don't call them trainings, I think of them as educational experiences, because you're not training people, you're engaging in a discussion and helping to create a framework, which is what we've got to do, create a framework for our members to make sense of the craziness that's going on out there. So there are materials that are available, and it's a question of whether people want to engage them. The national AFL-CIO, up until Trump was elected in 2016, had a race commission that was doing some quite interesting things. And then when Trump was elected, it just feels like they lost heart and just didn't do anything anymore. But we need to be moving those discussions. We've got to be dealing with not just how do we more get along, but who are our friends and who are our enemies as working people? That's the decisive question. So I think that there's some resources out there that your council and others can use.
I'd like to take a quick moment of facilitator's privilege here and ask something based on some of what you were saying a moment ago, Bill, and some of what Denise mentioned, because so much of this conversation has been framed around how to tackle the conversation on the right. But I think, there's also, I think, strands of conversation between liberals and progressives and leftists that also, I think, have been damaging to trying to build this sort of sense of a racial solidarity, class struggle orientation. Particularly, and I'm just interested because I do think that this actually, in some ways, accidentally plays into building a right-wing narrative in some ways. And I'd just be interested in your thoughts on it. A sort of a way of talking about racial justice work that really refuses to acknowledge, I think, that there is white self-interest in defeating white supremacy, rather than simply it being a moral or altruistic venture by white folks.
So what's happened over the years is that there has been the growth of multicultural versions of neoliberalism and anti-sexist versions of neoliberalism that completely ignore class, or they do it quite consciously to the benefit of the employer class. So that means that our discussions of race, our discussions of gender, need to be linked with class and linked with understanding the way capitalism operates. Well, for me, that begins with a historical analysis. It's one of my frustrations with so-called diversity trainings that really, very touchy-feely, you try my food, I try yours, we sing Kumbaya and start crying, right? As opposed to understanding the very roots of this country that help one figure out why and how race was introduced, towards what purpose, how does it function on a daily basis? And that goes beyond how people interact, what pronouns they use and things like that. It goes into understanding systems. So Colin, it's really about what kind of educational program you put together and the extent to which you connect that to changing the practice of the movement. This is one of my criticisms of a number of unions that have, decent racial justice programs, educational programs, but it's disconnected from the actual practice of the organization. What kind of issues do they take up? What kind of struggles do they engage in? Are they fighting in the workplace around hiring policies, around promotional policies? Are they fighting around how toxic waste and what communities that goes to? Are they dealing with that, or are they basically filing overtime grievances and then doing these other kind of general trainings about race and gender? So I think that, you know, when I learned years ago about the Packing House Workers Union, which no longer exists, it was absorbed by the UFCW, I was like amazed. This was a union, predominantly white, but a huge segment that was African American, that was very anti-racist and really understood that it was the job of the union to fight racial hiring practices, racist hiring practices. You know how most unions say, well, we'll deal with you once you've gotten hired. Not so with the packing house workers. They challenged the employers on how they hired. They challenged employers on internal segregation in the workplace. They were able to build up this sort of camaraderie within their membership that even in places like Boston in 1954, which was not exactly a city that was waving the red flag, right? That when they went on strike, the black and white workers stuck together and won, right? Because the leadership was courageous and the leadership understood the centrality of the race question. That's what we need.
Thanks so much, Bill. We've got two hands here, but we've also got about 10 minutes. Or is that Maria? Maria, did you have a hand up on this? You did. Okay. So we've got about 10 minutes here to wrap up the conversation, and I also want to give a brief minute to each of our panelists to close out themselves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Jim and Maria and ask both of you to sort of briefly frame your questions. And maybe Gary, Karen, and Bill can sort of fold those into closing comments. Is that okay?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, sure.
Fantastic. So we'll do Jim and then Maria.
Just a brief story on what Bill and you, Colin, were talking about. I think we need to emphasize stories where racism hurts white people. You know, we've always said in Rochester, going back to Chavez and King and Jackson, civil rights and workers' rights are the same struggle, the struggle for human rights. There's a great lady who's written a book, and one of the simplest stories she tells is the swimming pool story. When I was growing up, only rich people had swimming pools. The rest of us had public pools. We had one in Rochester, the natatorium, the high schools. In the deep South, where it's extremely hot, unless you lived on the ocean, every town had a public swimming pool. They were segregated. Blacks were usually allowed to use the pool once a week, and then they drained it and put in all new water before the whites went in. Well, after the '64 Civil Rights Act, they had to integrate public pools. The South, rather than do that, closed all their public swimming pools all across the South. So white families and white kids in that sweltering heat had no place to go swimming, and all those white kids suffered too. And there are all kinds of stories like that that we need to explain to our own members, how racism hurts them, hurts white people, not just black people. It hurts white people. That's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Jim. Maria?
Yeah, Jim, that was great. And when you said that, I immediately thought of the work that Reverend Barber does with the Poor People's Campaign.
Great,
where
man.
he talks about the places that are most racist, are most poor, across everything. But I guess I have kind of a statement question. Sorry, Colin, I'm gonna do it. And you had mentioned earlier about, you know, the progressives and liberals, the conversation amongst ourselves. And I have found that people are afraid of being called Antifa. And I think we just have to let that go. If we're anti-fascist, we should be proudly anti-fascist, because people have been anti-fascist for a very long time. And it's a wonderful heritage, and I wear it proudly. Okay, so sometimes I think people can lead by example with doing that. But the thing about who embraces fascism, ruling class people embrace fascism because it serves their interests, and they want power and they want money and they want to control everything, and they think everybody else is less human than they are. But working class people embrace fascism because they're afraid. They're afraid for economic reasons. You know, they're afraid for a myriad of reasons that mostly all go back to economics. So here's my question. How do we cultivate and encourage bravery in our movement? How do we do that? And I think it's I'm really asking the open-ended question that I don't know the answer to, but I feel like it's crucial to it. And so there's my question. Where do we get courage?
Great, thank you, Maria. So the way I want to do this, just to wrap us up here, is we'll give final comments to Gary, Karen, and Bill, just for a few seconds. We've got about 5 minutes left here, and I'm going to just now thank everyone for coming out and spending this evening having these conversations. I think they're really important and valuable, and spending the time to do this is really a big step for all of you. So thank you so much for helping us build this together. And I want to thank you now so that Bill can actually have the final word. So we'll go to Gary and then Karen, and then Bill, you can wrap us up, and hopefully the conversations will continue beyond here.
I'll be brief. Thanks everyone. It was a really, really great discussion, and happy to be a part of it. I'll piggyback on Maria's point, because I covered it in my opening remarks too, of proudly saying, we in our some of my union published and in these times we say we are Antifa. So I like that, and I'll like to hear Karen and Bill kind of wrap up here. So that's all I'll say to end it. But thanks again, everyone.
I almost forgot about the mute button. Yeah, the member of CBTU, the purpose of our organization is to build a bridge between community and labor, because let's face it, we're all community and we're all labor, whether we're in a union or not. And we need to reach out to people and educate people. So if we get together, that's where CBTU kind of comes into the fold. We can be the bridge between the community, because I saw a question earlier about how do we bring in people who are not part of a labor union, who have barriers. As a constituency group, we reach out to other constituency groups and we reach out to labor. So that's our function, and that's our goal. So if anybody wants to set up a kind of forum with the community and labor, we're more than happy to help out.
I want to thank everyone for this and for inviting me. We have a lot more to explore in this because we have some differences, and differences are not bad as long as they're not treated as some sort of act of war. We can flesh out these differences. I remain very optimistic, but I think that the optimism is tempered by recognizing some of the weaknesses of our movement. I used to be a shipyard worker in Quincy, Massachusetts, and I worked with all kinds of people. I was one of my coworkers at one point, a white guy I got along with very well, that I thought of as progressive. He was involved with some of our rank and file work. He and I were taking a break, and we got into a discussion somehow about race, and he says to me, if I had a daughter and she married a black guy, I would excommunicate her. And he says this looking straight at me. I mean, it's not like he had ambiguity and thought, well, maybe Bill is from Northern Norway or something, right? I mean, it was like he knew exactly what I was. And he said it as if he was saying, tomorrow the sun will rise. He didn't think that there was anything offensive about that. I didn't hold that against him. I looked at it as, okay, everybody's going to be uneven. I'm going to try to work with this guy and win him over time. And I think that we have to have a certain level of optimism when we're in the working class that we can actually win people over. But it's not going to happen simply on the basis of a common enemy. It's not going to happen based just on economics, because there's other things that are going on. There's a lot of fear that exists about changing demographics. There's a lot of fear that's very historical about if people of color, and particularly if African Americans receive justice, will that mean that we will do unto white people what was done to us? This may sound crazy, but that is there in the thinking. So it's not just about economics. We've got a lot of work we've got to do about unpacking the racial injustice, the way this whole system came together, and why it has been so successful. And I'll leave it there.
Well, thanks so much, everybody. I think, we know that the conversation continues, but I again, thanks to the panelists for being here, and thanks everyone for spending the evening doing this with us.
Thanks, Colin.
There will be future conversations for sure.
Thanks, Connell. Thanks, panel.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Take care.